This is part one of a two-part video series on breeding greenback twin spots in two different scenarios from the same initial group of imported birds in September of this year. The first pair is self-selected from this group and raised 3 chicks in a mixed aviary. This video summarizes what I think might be the important details. Note that October and November is the normal breeding season for this species. From day one, while in quarantine, the birds had access to many of the triggers for breeding: nest sites, nest material, sufficient daylight, live food, space, and quiet. The males were singing and displaying on day one after arriving at my place, and I was watching for any indication of females interested or any kind of joint activities between the male and a female. The pair that we're going to follow in this video gave their first indication they were pairing up on day 2 as they began investigating nest sites, in particular this nest site. By day 4, they were pretty much inseparable, and by day 5, I separated them from the rest of the group. Throughout this process, live food that was available included melanogaster fruit flies, live in water, freeze-dried fruit flies, frozen termites, live mealworms, live buffalo worms, and I'll also mention egg food and sprouted seed. After quarantine, the pair were moved into the mixed species aviary. None of the species were in breeding condition except for the twin spots, and there's about 200 cubic foot of space per bird in the aviary. Here's the temperature and humidity profile inside the aviary over the course of the entire breeding cycle. The aviary has significant exposure to sunlight and supplemental lighting to maintain 14 hours a day of light. The pair made full use of the aviary, including the treetops, the undercover, foraging on the ground, and the stream for bathing. And within 3 days, they had picked out a nest site at the top of one of the trees, as evidenced by a lot of futzing with the foliage, which unfortunately does not respond very well because it's plastic. After 4 days of fruitless manipulation of the foliage, I created this reed ball, covered it in plastic seagrass, and placed it as close as possible to where they were futzing, and within a day they had adopted it and were building. The nest was a typical dome structure, about 3/4 the size of the ball, so maybe 6 inches in diameter. The nest chamber was at the back, and so there was effectively a tubular entrance into it of about 2 inches. The primary nesting material was sisal and burlap, about 4-inch long strings. There were no feathers or white lining that was put into the nest. It was principally burlap. The male did most of the nesting material gathering, and the female did most of the building, it appeared to me. 3 days after the nest was completed, the first egg was laid, the first of 4. Up until this time, the birds had consistent access to live fruit flies, live mealworms and buffalo worms, and frozen termites. When the eggs were laid, I discontinued termites, but I kept the rest of the live food in the mix. They also had seed, millet spray, oyster shell, crushed eggshells, egg food, and sprouted seed always available to them. Sitting began in earnest after the 3rd egg was laid, and the sitting time was 13 days, right on the nose. I'm going to estimate that the female did about 85% of the sitting, and if she happened to be out in the aviary when I came in, she quickly hustled back to the nest and went back inside and took over. My impression is that it's exceedingly important that she has privacy to eat and drink and bathe during the times when she happens to be out of the nest. And if she were interrupted, then she would forego that opportunity. I was surprised to discover that I could not hear the babies begging for the first 4 days. And in fact, they have a silent begging mode. And I've discovered the birds in the basement have utilized that. And I did not hear them until they were about 10 days old. Another interesting note is that the parents have different feeding priorities. I have noticed with both of my pairs, although they're different. In this pair, the female always eats the wingless fruit flies first, and then she will eat buffalo worms and later converted more toward the mealworms. The male eats the wingless fruit flies first and egg food second. The combination of both parents feeding made for a pretty broad nutritional profile for the chicks, and that might be important. I will give a better estimate of the quantity of live food taken with the second pair because they were alone in a flight cage as opposed to the aviary where the food was shared. However, I will say that live food was available within 20 minutes of the lights coming on in the morning, and it was replenished every 2 hours. I would guess every 2 hours they went through 500 fruit flies and between 20 and ultimately 40 buffalo worm, mealworm combinations. The worms were always served with calcium powder or vitamin powder or cod liver oil or mineral powder. The babies fledged at 16 days and progressed rapidly like they always do. I would say they were very sedentary compared to some of the other species that I have raised. Pretty content to get put somewhere and stay put. Both parents were excellent feeders and shared the duties pretty evenly as best I could tell. Anticipating that the babies would continue to use the nest for the first few days, I left it alone, but cleaned it 5 days after they left. And as it was apparent they had taken over a different site, the parents had been investigating some other nesting sites as well, as is typical for a second clutch. And when this one was clean, they began rebuilding in it within the day. At 23 days old, the parents were noticeably slowing down their response to the begging, and the babies were beginning to forage, particularly millet spray. At 25 days old, the chicks were quite independently doing their own thing, and the new nest for the parents was about half done. When the babies hit 30 days, I noticed that the father was getting a little bit testy with them hanging around, so I moved them into their own flight cage. So the babies are growing up, will be going through their molt over the next couple of months, and 1 day later, there was the first egg in the new nest. And that is the end of this accounting. In part 2, I'll summarize what's happening with another pair, completely different circumstances, hoping that this might be helpful information for someone.